Hi there, my name is Philip Eidson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And today on the podcast, I wanted to share with you a recording of a recent AOP live webinar that was facilitated by Kelly Barner, and I joined in to pose questions received in real time from our live audience. We're joined by Joe Yacura, founder of the International Association for Data Quality, Governance and Analytics, shortened to IADQGA, and a former Chief Procurement Officer, as well as Vishal Patel, VP of Product Marketing at iValuer. This AOP Live session focused on the results of the 5th Annual Data Quality and Governance Study conducted by the IADQGA, with Joe and Vishal answering a number of questions related to data quality and actionability, including how to get started on a data quality journey despite the complexity of today's business environment, best practices and rules of thumb about the lifespan of corporate data, and what procurement should be doing differently and better, or better even, with the system-generated data they already have access to. Kelly started by posing the first question to Joe, asking him how data quality became an area of professional focus after a career as a procurement executive.
I started my career early on in IBM. Spent quite a few years there, and one of the things that at that point I would be rotated in and out of different functions every 12 to 18 months. So procurement, contracting, production control, manufacturing, etc. And we think today we have lots of data, and I'm going back 20, 30 years now. I was in one of the divisions in IBM, and I had the responsibility for 6,000 or 10,000 part numbers worldwide, the manufacturing and the inventory of these part numbers, which was a very interesting challenge. And I kind of noticed that in my organization, every day a person would come through literally with a cart of massive printouts. And the printouts were probably about 12 inches high, if you can imagine that, in the days of massive amounts of data and paper. And they would leave these printouts at everyone's desk. And one day, I just thinking about how can you absorb all this much data? It was refreshed every day. So what I did was without telling anyone, I cut off the printing of those reports to see if anyone would ask the question, where were they? And obviously that would lead to the assumption they were using the data. Reality, no one questioned what happened to the reports. So it kind of highlighted that we had massive amounts of data coming in. Again, this is 20, 30 years ago. Today it's a huge multiple of that. And so that's kind of started my focus on how do we use data to better manage the supply chain overall. So that's kind of what triggered my thoughts. And then through various career changes, when I was at American Express and Pacific Bell and Bank of America, etc., we had built tools to start to use data. But what it showed was, as we started to build these tools, we really didn't have a good command of where our data was coming from, how many data sources we used, what data was used for what type of decision making. We also found the issue of who really owns the data. Yeah. And what we found was in the supply chain functions, at least, there really wasn't anyone. And even today, and I don't want to take all the time at the beginning here, so I'll go over to Vishal, but that's kind of how I got started, an awareness that all this was happening around us, but where we're getting value from the data. And the sad scenario is that we weren't at that time. And even today, we are sub-optimizing the value we're deriving from data in the supply chain function. So I'll stop there, turn it over, and
Sure. So, and we're certainly going to spend a lot of time talking about that today. The reassuring expectation to set right up front. We will get into some numbers, but data is a problem that we all share together. No one has perfect data, right? There are all kinds of different data challenges, but we're all dealing with them together. Now, Vishal, slightly different question for you. Anybody that follows you or iValuer on social media knows that you had an amazing in-person event in DC last week. Looked like you had both a lot of fun and also some great weather. So for anybody who wasn't able to either attend your event or maybe hasn't been back into an in-person event, I think I speak for all of us when I ask, what is the buzz? So what was everybody talking about? What did you hear at coffee breaks? What was the focus of conversation? What seems to be top of mind for the guests and speakers that you had at the event last week?
Yeah, great question, and thanks for having me here, and Joe, good to connect again. Yeah, so last week was a very good event for us. It was great to be back in person after 2 years. You know, one thing that stands out in terms of what people were talking about was, you know, obviously lots in the news about what's going on in the world today, right? And what I pulled out from this was that in a lot of organizations, there's a little bit of a shift from being in a buyer's market. So if you think about the real estate world, we've gone in many industries, if not all, from what was a buyer's market where you determine, you know, and can you as a buyer determine which suppliers you can work with, how you work with them, you know, it's stronger on the buyer side in terms of a relationship to a suppliers or sellers market in today's world, right? And where suppliers have more of a choice and a decision on which customers to work with. And so as a buyer, if you are unfriendly and if you have outdated business practices, if you're not paying on time, if you're not offering some sort of, you know, deeper collaboration and a path to growth for that supplier, then they might decide not to work with you. And today, more, and I wouldn't say all, but more suppliers have that option today than they've had before. And so as procurement, you know, one of the things is that procurement's been transforming a lot, right? And in the last 2 years, it's maybe even accelerated, hyper accelerated what procurement is doing. But it's gone from, yes, now you still have to do savings because inflation. You still have to, you know, focus on risk and performance because of various supply chain disruptions, various activities going on in the world. You know, you need to make sure that you have products to sell, but at the same time, you have to build stronger relationships, and that's what fuels a lot of what organizations need right now, right? It's maybe not so much about the top line growth, but actually it's about maintaining growth and maintaining margin, right? And maintaining, and to do that, you need to have stronger supplier relationships. And you need to be the customer of choice. And I think that's what a lot of the discussions I heard from Ivaio now. Yeah.
No, I think that's really interesting because we're going to divide today's conversation into sort of 2 high-level sections. We're going to start by digging a little bit into what are we really talking about when we discuss data quality, how do we measure it, how do we define it, where do people stand on how they perceive their data quality. But then we're going to pause and we're actually going to go into applying some of this. And I know, Vishal, what you've mentioned around companies trying to become a customer of choice to their suppliers, that is absolutely an area where we can take the data that we have, we can work on the quality, and hopefully it ends up improving those relationships. So I think that's an excellent point. So pin in that, we're definitely coming back to that topic. As we start to get into the meat of today's conversation, Joe, this might sound like maybe an overly simple question, but I actually think it's deceptive. When we talk about data quality, it's easy to throw that phrase out, but what are we actually talking about? How do you define or measure data quality such that we empower ourselves to act and improve it?
Yeah, well, a great question. It sounds like a simple question. It should be a simple answer, but in reality, it's very complicated. You know, we look at data and we look at data has different attributes. We have data, the completeness of the data, the relevance of the data to that decision, the accuracy, the timeliness, the lineage of that data. You know, where did that data come from? Was that a summary of a summary that was put together 6 months ago for a different purpose? So if we back it all away, the kind of most simplest definition is, what is quality? Quality is meeting requirements. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the level of detail and the frequency of data that we want. Let's say we're making a pharmaceutical, a drug. We're going to want to have high frequency of sampling of those ingredients and the accuracy and the units of measure that go into all of those pills, if you will, or medication that you're developing or producing. If we're running a bakery and we're making loaves of bread, we want to have the formula, the recipe pretty much the same. But, you know, if we vary a few grams here and there or whatever, and if we sample it, every hour, the risk of using that data is minimal on the effect of the output. So one of the big challenges I think we're facing as a supply chain is, and I don't say this lightly, but I really believe we as a supply chain function are in a battle for supply chain data supremacy. Whatever supplier and customer can communicate at the levels that they both need as far as data goes to manage their operations, whether as a supplier or a customer, those two trading partners are going to win overall in the marketplace. We looked at data before, and data, it's interesting because we're transitioning where data is going. Most of the data up to really about maybe 3 or 4 years ago, we were using data to complete a transaction. And the data and we used data to reflect our success in the past. So if we were off by a little bit, it didn't really matter because we were reporting what took place. Now we're trying to move data from a reporting on historical information to using data to do predictive modeling and forecasting so that we can optimize our resources, our supplier resources, optimize the logistics chain, etc. So as we're moving from using data to report historical information to one of planning and forecasting, the degree of data, the level of detail we need has increased dramatically. The frequency that we want that data, access to it, has increased dramatically. Do we have people who are reviewing the data and saying this data is okay for this purpose when making this decision and is not appropriate when using this data for this other decision? I usually start off my conferences and seminars or when I do consulting with a company, the first question I ask kind of is, has anyone taken a data course? Which is kind of interesting because usually you get a kind of squeamish 1 or 2 hands get raised. And the vast people say, yeah, well, we all talk about data, we all use data, but we've never really even had a course on data literacy and data governance, right? We just take it for granted. So it's something that's so critical and so basic to the functions we perform, but we really necessarily haven't been trained formally on how to use this data.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting time. And what's very interesting is as you're seeing, and I've been in a supply chain function for many, many years, right? And we've been always trying to compete for the sphere of influence that the supply chain function can bring to the overall organization. Well, the sphere of influence today of the supply chain function is increasing dramatically based on our ability to use data.
Yeah.
And, I always ask too is when you go out to a supplier, this is from obviously the customer perspective, but when you're going out to a supplier, do you specify your data requirements in your RFQs, RFIs, RFPs, whatever vehicle you use to source? Less than half, at least in the studies that we've done, and our study, again, will be provided on a website, our 5th annual study, but in there it shows that less than half the people actually specify their requirements, data requirements, that is, during the sourcing process and the contract negotiation process. And only after we've signed an agreement with the supplier do we start raising these relevant questions around data. And in many cases, the supplier either is or is not willing to provide that data, is or isn't capable of providing that level of data, is or is not capable of providing that data at that frequency level or in those units of measure. So we are at a very critical pivoting point here as to how we use data, and the focus has dramatically increased over the last 3 to 5 years.
Yeah. Now, one quick follow-up for you, because you talked about sort of this classic example of legacy procurement driving forward while looking in the rearview mirror. You talked a little bit about us trying to move towards more predictive use of data. Can you just speak very briefly about the timing expectations? So generally speaking, I know there's a lot of different kinds of data and a lot of different systems we might be talking about, but when is data too old? How often should data be refreshed? Are we talking in months, weeks, days, hours?
Yeah.
The evolving notion of what real time means. Just a comment for you on time.
Yeah. Great question. It's all a function of what is the use of the data. You know, in some cases, we can run a business with data that's a day or a week old, or maybe even a month old. In other cases, we have to have data that's literally as close to real time, and that's variable. By everybody has a different term of what real time is. The challenge is that most of our data sources are in multiple silos, and that's like one of the things that like Evalua, their systems, and others bring this together. And what we're seeing now is a trend for everybody realizing the importance of data. They want to buy the best in class solutions for each component, from the purchase side all the way to the pay side. That is a very dangerous road to go down, because we all know when you try to integrate all these multiple independent systems that use different data formats, different data file formats, you know, collecting data at different frequencies, units of measure, it's a nightmare. So I think we have to start going to best in class overall solutions, purchase to pay solutions. That's where we should be focusing on, not trying to buy independent applications or solutions for each element of the supply chain process.
Now, the irony of this next data point I want to share with you both didn't actually hit me until I was listening to you talk about quality, Joe. So hopefully this data that I'm going to share meets the Joe Yacura quality standard. But we decided last week to throw a quick poll out on LinkedIn and give people an opportunity to share their perspective on the quality of their data. So this was a poll that Phil posted, and it was very subjective. I perceive our company's data to be. The vast majority of people, just shy of 80%, acknowledge that there's some type of issue. 40% of them say our data is awful. We have a real problem here. And just behind that, 38% say, our data's okay, but we have work to do. Now, 3% of the group actually has no idea. So hopefully that 3% from the poll has decided to join us today. But then we've got about 19% saying that they have great, high quality, trusted data. Vishal, first to you. So 80% of the people who selected themselves to participate in our poll are acknowledging that there's an issue. Does that align with maybe what you hear in working with customers or what you might have heard last week? Do you think it's generally accepted that data is a very common source of business challenges?
So yes, I think in most cases, customers that are coming to us for a technology around source to contract, around procure to pay, around the full source to pay process, they have some limitations on what they can do data-wise with their current systems or processes, right? They have limitations, and those limitations they can come from multiple places. So one could be just an inability to get the right level of integrations across their systems to get the right data in place. The other place it could come from is more supplier focused, right? So anyone in procurement will know that dealing with and keeping reliable and accurate supplier master data is a challenge, no matter which organization you are. If you haven't deliberately addressed it, it's most likely a challenge, right? Outdated supplier information, outdated certificates, generally outdated supplier master data. And the problem is not that it's totally outdated everywhere, it's that even if it's updated in one place, it's not being updated everywhere that it's required. And so again, it's an integration issue. So a lot of those issues come up where if you think about all of the interactions a company has with its suppliers or supply chain, there's a lot of data involved in all those interactions. And if you start having different systems, as Joe just mentioned, you are starting different systems where you're doing sourcing, and one where you're doing purchase orders, and another where you're doing risk, which, in a perfect world, all those systems work together and the data is seamless and you have visibility across everything. But that's a dream that is unlikely to come true for most organizations. And we believe that most organizations are going to a place where they have a handful of platforms dealing with the big segments of data, right? So you have a single platform for all your customers. And yes, that platform will connect probably to other data, other technologies, but there is one core platform where all the data is connected to. Similarly, you would have organizations, we believe, are moving to a place where they have a single platform for all of their supplier and spend data. And yes, that core platform may connect to other ecosystems, right? Like travel or risk or whatever it is, but they have to be connected to some core platform where you have all your supplier and spend data. So we think that's the way organizations are going to evolve, is a handful of platforms, for customers, suppliers, operations, financials, HR, right? Like they're going to all be sort of core platforms with their own ecosystems around them, but that's sort of our approach, and that's how you can begin to get control and manage the data and the quality and the reliability and so on.
Yeah. Now, Joe, I'm going to give you an opportunity to comment openly, but the first thing I want to know from you right off the bat, the 19% of respondents that said, nope, we're good, our data's great. How does that, can we give that a quick smell test? Does 19% seem right? Do you think, are some of the 80% that said they had a problem being too hard on themselves, are part of the 19% in denial? Where would you expect those numbers to fall?
Yeah, I think in the 19%, 20% roughly is probably pretty parallel to our study and other consulting firm studies. What you find, the question is who's responding to the question, because in some cases it's the data is there and it may be usable, but that individual may not have access to the data. So the first question is who has access to the data and for what purpose? The next question is the data in a format that they can interpret? So you're seeing more and more, our studies show too, more and more over the years, and our study is 5 years, so we have a little bit of a pattern here and a little bit of a trend, that we're seeing more and more people starting to use visualization tools to help them understand and interpret the vast amounts of data. So if they have access to the data, is the first question. Is the data there that they need, relevant, timely, complete, accuracy, all those issues? That's another issue. The next one is, can they interpret the data in a way that they can then interpret it so they get an understanding and then present it to the audience or the decision maker? So a 20% is right. I mean, there's kind of an interesting, just a side study, and I just happen to have a brief note here. There was a study done by MIT in November 21, and the question was, did you have supplier visibility by supplier tier? So, you have your first tier supplier, second tier, and third tier. Well, their study showed that only 48% said they have visibility, some visibility to the data that they need for the tier 1.
Okay.
Tier 2 was down to 21% at something, and tier 3 was down to 2%. 11% said that they really don't have any visibility to what they think they need in their supply chain. So it's a series of issues when you ask that broad question that could contribute to that kind of response of 20%. What our study and other studies are showing is that senior executives, regardless of the size of the organization, everyone knows that the world needs to be more dependent on data to help them make quicker, better informed decisions. While that said, our study shows that between 2 years of the study, the companies actually spent less money training people on how to use data. At the same time, they're saying it's more important. So data is a massive challenge. I think one of the things that people need to do to get going, or maybe I'll stop there, and I don't want to go too far away from your question.
Just if I can just comment on,
of course,
what you said, that you mentioned the mapping of your supply chain. So that's clearly an issue, and actually what we ended up doing with iValue and one of our customers and now a few others is figuring out how we can get our customers and their suppliers and their suppliers involved in visualizing that mapping. Because what's important is not only that you know who the tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers are, but you understand the relationships between the tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers to your tier 1 supplier, right? Because ultimately that's what's going to help you avoid risk and performance issues. And once you have that visual map, then you are able to, again, make better decisions. So that's something that, you know, we ended up working with one of our customers on in developing that. And it's been hugely helpful in the last 2 years, of course.
Well, Vishal, I would like to stay with you for one more question, and then I'm going to switch over and check in with Phil and see what's happening in the chat. But I think we very effectively set the stage. Data quality is a challenge. And even in addition to that, as Joe added, training and application are subsequent challenges once the data quality improves. In order to provide a little bit of incentive to really get procurement to double down and emphasize this and make the investment that needs to be made, I'd like to get your thoughts on sort of the opportunity for executive level relevance and even potentially external relevance. You know, we talk a lot about ESG. You've mentioned becoming a customer of choice and being perceived as easier to work with by suppliers. What would you say are the incentives for procurement, selfishly speaking, from a career standpoint, from an internal influence standpoint? What are sort of the dangling carrots to give us the reason to buckle down and get the data quality right and get the training that we need to put that data into action?
That's a, you know, the answer to that question can be quite broad. I think it depends on what is the priority areas, right? And you mentioned ESG, for example. So just take one sliver of ESG, which is diversity. A lot of what diversity in procurement and supply chain, it's about the data you have on your suppliers and their diversity status, right? And it used to be that it was very much a reporting exercise. I need to report out to our shareholders how much our diverse spend is. Or if I'm a state procurement agency, I have some obligations on how much diverse spend I have, right? Very much a reporting exercise. So that was something that kind of by regulation sort of kind of evolved into, hey, we have to report on it. But now it's become so much more than just a reporting exercise, right? It has to be a little bit more in terms of how we are working with diverse suppliers and developing them, and even investing in diverse suppliers and growing, you know, the amount of business and the amount of activities we have with those diverse suppliers. But it did begin with the data and how much you know about it. And the same thing for ESG. A lot of the sustainability focus right now is on carbon reduction, right? And with carbon reduction, you can only reduce carbon if you know how much you have being emitted, right? And there's various levels, your scope 1 emissions, your scope 2, and when dealing with suppliers, it's scope 3 emissions. And you need to have some sort of a baseline on what it is you're buying from those suppliers and how much that is equivalent in terms of a CO2 emissions. But it starts with the data on that. And your suppliers, for the most part, they're not going to have the capability to calculate their own CO2 emissions. So you have to be able to provide some sort of a guidance or a tool for them to do that, or you have to do it for them. Because otherwise, there's no way to figure out, like, I need to reduce, you know, I have a target. And this is what one of our things we talked about at Avaya now. You know, we can help companies, like, if you have a target of reducing carbon emissions by 100,000 tons over the next 3 years, it's going to take multiple initiatives with multiple suppliers. It might be that you're changing how they're delivering to you, or it might be that you're changing a component from, you know, plastic to recyclable material, or it might be that they're changing their energy consumption to produce what they're selling you. But those are all specific initiatives with specific suppliers that start with an understanding of the data about the CO2 emissions based on the category you're buying from. So just a couple of thoughts there. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I'd like to just follow on Vishal's comments. There's, you know, when you look before, again, as a supply chain person, because I spent most of my career in the supply chain, you know, the data that we provided was primarily for internal consumption. The supply chain rarely provide data that ultimately got out to stockholders or regulatory agencies. It was more, you know, about, you know, price, performance, delivery, warranty, reliability, those sorts of things. So the audience was somewhat less of a threat, if you will. because if we made a mistake, it was internal reporting in most cases. That, going to Vishal's point, is starting to have a dramatic turn based on the focus on ESG. And you can kind of see this happening at least in two different areas. Right now in the United States, the Securities and Exchange Commission, for their 10K reporting and requirements, et cetera, for any publicly traded company in the United States, has out for circulation a set of standards and reporting requirements around ESG. A lot of those they talk about, and the terminology they use is the parent corporation, its affiliates. It doesn't say suppliers specifically or vendors, but you can it's alluding to that. There's another international initiative going at the same time that's being driven by the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB. They're again doing kind of what the same thing as the Securities and Exchange Commission draft document in circulation now for approval is doing. It's the same sort of thing. So, and they're linking their reporting to another group called the International Financial Reporting Standards. So as these financial organizations or reporting organizations start to require this data that's being reported around various elements of ESG, the only place they're going to get that data is from the supply chain. And that's a new use, and this has a new level of liability because that data has to be correct. Where before, if it was for internal consumption, it was off. Okay, somebody would not be happy, but it wouldn't come back with some penalties and fines and additional controls. One thing I failed to mention earlier on is this whole idea of data quality. A lot of the organizations, there's an organization called ISO, International Standards Organization. ISO has actually put out ISO 8000. And ISO 8000, the title of ISO 8000 is data quality. So all this stuff is starting to come together. The requirements, like I say, I don't think supply chain organizations are not prepared to do the level of reporting and detail to meet some of this financial reporting that will be required here in the next year or two. So lots going on.
There absolutely is a lot going on. And as you said, Joe, the stakes are getting higher and higher.
Yes.
I want to pause there and bring Phil back into the conversation. I can see everything lighting up on the GoToWebinar board here, so I know there's conversations going on. Phil, are there any questions or comments that you've been having with the audience that you want to bring into the conversation?
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. There's really just a couple that I wanted to bring up, especially kind of in the interest of time. The first one is very tactical, and this is to Vishal. Vishal, we're talking about uses of data, and you mentioned, understanding mapping your tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, and that's something that we've struggled with in supply chain for so long. Like, there's so much obvious benefit of doing so, but it seems like it's one of those things that we haven't been as successful as we would have liked to have been able to put that into practice. And I just wonder if you could kind of share from, you mentioned a couple of folks that you've been working with, like how can you start getting visibility into that kind of data? Like, where do you go for that kind of data?
Yeah, sure. Happy to share that. So what we have done with a few of our customers now is they've approached it in two ways. So one is that the customer has already done some mapping or gotten some data from their suppliers on who the tier 2 suppliers are. And they are then uploading that into Evalua and mapping it out so that they can understand for supplier A, these are all its tier 2 suppliers, but you have now a way and a structure in the system to view that and also set up additional information to be added by those tier 2 suppliers. The other approach is that, customers are, they're typically in all of our customers, they're bringing all their suppliers into Evalua anyway, the tier 1 suppliers. And those that are using this, we call it a sub-tier mapping functionality. Those that are using that have basically sent out questionnaires to their suppliers, which those suppliers can invite their tier 2 suppliers, and tier 2 can invite their tier 3 suppliers. They've all been sent some sort of standard questionnaires to fill out information on the type of company, the details about the company, and that then helps map it out visually, so that you can start doing additional types of data collection as well. So you can then begin to request your suppliers' data, and some of this ties back to an organization's code of ethics that it's getting its suppliers to agree to. So in some very well-known companies, they have a pretty strict code of ethics that they need their suppliers to abide by, and in that code of ethics, basically it's telling them that you need to help us understand who your suppliers are, and it's your responsibility to help us map out who your suppliers are, because otherwise we cannot really do business with you, right? And that's obviously on the extreme side, but given the brands and the type of companies, like suppliers are willing to do that because of what it means for their business. So those are the approaches they've taken, and once you have that in the system, you're able to then map out visually relationships between different suppliers. You're able to see risk and performance. You're able to collect additional levels of data as well. And on top of this, what we can do as well is layer in data from third-party sources. So you can have, as long as you know the company names of the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and whatever, you can fill any gaps in data through other sources like Dun & Bradstreet or Bureau van Dijk or other data sources which are kind of connected to the Avaya platform. So there's a few different ways there to do it, but it does start with obviously the having all your suppliers in one system that you can start from and kind of build out from there.
Thanks, Vishal. And given time, I'm going to hand back to Kelly, actually, and I'll hold my other question to the end if we do have time at the end. But I do have just one follow-up, Vishal, and that's, post-pandemic, have you seen suppliers and tier 1 suppliers be more open and willing to share the details of their supply chain, whereas perhaps in the past they may have not really wanted to do that with their customers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of been proven with many customers, where the transparency, it helps both sides of the relationship, right? And ultimately, like a buyer is going to do business with those suppliers that are collaborative, are kind of transparent with what's going on. In some cases, there are regulations that are involved. So in Germany, there's a Supply Chain Act, which kind of requires a certain level of transparency across an organization's supply chain. So in some cases, it's not really a choice, depending on which region you're in. In other cases, there's sanctions involved, and in order to abide by the sanctions, you need to understand who you're doing business with. So it goes back to this whole, like, having a good enough picture of your suppliers, but having that tier 1 view is just not enough, because ultimately you are then responsible for slave labor happening in the tier 3 of your supplier, right? It's in the news all the time, but ultimately it's the buying organization that's responsible. So they will take actions to prevent that.
Thanks, Vishal.
And thank you, Phil. We'll definitely come back to you before the top of the hour. Now, Joe, when we think about the things that procurement can control, maybe 2 of the very high-level places to start are areas where we might be inadvertently making data quality worse. So an easy 2 are the systems choices that we make. How are we integrating systems? Where are we storing data? And of course, the other is process. Can you talk for a little bit, given the breadth of the whole procurement, whether you're looking at it as procure to pay or source to pay, when we're looking at a broad set of processes like that, what are the systems and process flow considerations we need to keep in mind so that we're not creating poor quality data, even as we're trying to clean up and improve the quality of data that we've already gathered?
Yeah, that's a good broad question. I'll attempt to try to pick away at parts of it in my response. One of the challenges, as I mentioned earlier, is that we're collecting data in order to make better informed decisions and to mitigate risk. We can't eliminate risk, but try to mitigate the risk. The challenge is that today, I'm not sure most supply chain functions have a real thorough, in-depth understanding of their data sources. What I mean by that is there are multiple sources of information, whether it be internally generated within the company, within the division, within that brand. Then you go to the supply chain, then you go to the regulatory requirements that are starting to build up around supply chain. So when we look at trying to get our hands around the data, typically we used to look at an organization based on people, process, and technology. Well, now that fourth element that has to be included is the data. So most companies have massive amounts of data, multiple sources. What I would recommend for somebody to start, and to start small, because even if you're a small organization, when you start getting into this, it has tentacles and it becomes very large.
Yeah.
I would say that starts initially with doing what term we call is a data audit. And at our association website, and I think we're going to have it at a valuable website soon too, is a guidelines on how to conduct a data audit. That's not an IT audit. That's a critical point because that'll raise a lot of questions and thoughts on, okay, who's in charge of data? How often is it if data has a shelf life? Who makes those decisions? Who disperses the data? When and how can it be used, etc. And then the next thing that has to happen, because if you do a data audit, that's only one small point of time. As we know, the volume of data is increasing, the velocity, it's huge. So that one point in time gets contaminated with other data, bad data, or incomplete data, etc., very quickly. So I think from starting with a data audit to understand kind of where you are, that should then immediately evolve into a data governance policy. And we need to have governance in the sense of, guidelines as to what data can be used for what decision, what sources are approved or not approved, what sources do we buy data from versus we just collect it. So you have to start there because it's such an overwhelming task. So my recommendation would be is you would start with a data audit just to get that overall awareness, start with a small project, and then put in a data governance strategy so that as data comes in, you now have confidence in the data. The problem with today's world, and it's not getting necessarily better, it's just becoming more surface, the tools that are out there are fabulous. The tools work great. It's the data that goes into the tool that is the problem. And until you can correct that, you're not going to get the benefit out of these very, very powerful applications that are out there. So that's how I would recommend starting a data audit. You're not going to audit the whole organization. You'll audit a small portion, understand the complexity of the issue, and then move to a data governance plan, which you need to have in the data governance. You need to have a committee, and I'm the biggest anti-bureaucracy person probably in the world. but to take this on, you need a committee, and the committee needs to be made of the supply chain function and the finance function and your audit function and your governance function, and your regulatory people. You need to have all those people involved because that's where all this data is eventually leading into meeting those different organizations' requirements. And if you get their buy-in on the design of the governance and the participation, it's something that will have cohesion. It'll start to stick. If it's strictly supply chain driven, the other functions will say, well, that's a supply chain initiative. I got my own initiatives. I'm too busy. I'll send a representative to every third meeting and we'll just go from there.
Yeah. Now, Vishal, one of the points that I really feel like has come across loud and clear is that, yes, we need higher quality data, but that's not the goal. The goal is what that higher quality data allows us to achieve. And so when we think about procurement either needing to build a business case or needing to win people over internally to this idea of investing in data quality, are we better off making the case that we can't mitigate risk without quality data? We can't ensure compliance without quality data. Should we be having conversations about what the data will allow us to achieve versus trying to have internal conversations about saying we need to fix our data and leave it at that?
Yeah, I think those are important questions. And the trouble with a data initiative is really the business case, right? Like, how do you create the business case to go and solve a data challenge? And so I do feel like in general, like you have to always think about the outcome of the data that you're trying to improve. Like, what is it going to help do? Is it going to help you make more efficient processes? Is it going to help you generate some business value that you're not getting now because of poor data? Because it's hard to say, it's the same like with risk, right? Like, how do you invest? Why do you invest in a risk solution? It's because you want to avoid risk. But what is the cost of avoiding risk? You don't know, because it could be, the $20 million penalty that you don't pay, but it's hard to validate that because you're avoiding something. And so that's always the challenge. And the same thing with investing in improving supplier master data, right? It's a big challenge. Everyone knows the pain of the challenge, but the business case around it is not so easy, because the business case involves, better process efficiency of basically your entire source to pay process. It involves, better analytics on spend and assessment of supplier risk. And so there's various aspects. So I think you have to always think about the outcome of what it is that you can achieve from a business value standpoint with that improved data. Is it that you'll be able to better mitigate and understand supplier risk? Is it that you'll be able to better identify which suppliers are appropriate for different objectives? Is it that you'll have more efficiency in how you're processing an invoice? Because that's important. That's adding value to your suppliers. It's making sure you're paying on time, making sure you're using working capital effectively, right? So what are the outcomes of that data?
Yeah, if I can interrupt, there was a study done, and I think it was about 2 years ago, by MIT, and it goes back to what's the value of having a data-driven decision-making organization. And their study showed that those companies who consider themselves data-driven decision-making capabilities had an ROI of 4 to 6% higher than those who don't. And that's one of the few studies that I've seen that kind of quantified, and I don't know how they came up with the mechanics of the calculation, but that's one of the, a single study to reference that talks about what's the ROI. Like you're saying, Kelly, what you mentioned, our goal is not just to say we have better data. This whole initiative is that make better, quicker, more informed, accurate decisions. That's what the data is all about. And one of the challenges that I have in thinking about where companies are going, I mentioned earlier visualization. I think that's a great tool because in the past we try to glean some sort of intelligence out of a matrix. This is very hard to do. If you're looking at rows and columns of numbers, where do you see the patterns? I think visualization has significantly advanced our ability to use the data. My question is where companies are spending a lot of money and time right now on creating and installing and training people on visualization tools. I don't think that's our end state. I think our end state is to have automated decisions being made for us at different levels of risk, operational decisions versus strategic decisions. But I don't want to downplay the importance of visualization. I think it's absolutely critical. But in my mind, that's not our end state. Our end state is, because when you think about it, you spend all that time to create the visualization of the data, and then you have to wait a week or more to get to the decision makers to present that. And now maybe you've lost the opportunity or the benefit of that interpretation of that data. So we're in a state of transition to on the technology, how we can leverage the different types of technology to help us make better supply chain decision in our supply chain activities.
Right. Well, to your point,
just to just to add on something, I think it's also very important to have the data in the same place that an action is being taken or a business process is being completed, right? Because only then can you really have the benefit of the data. Because if you have, think about it, if you have to go to one system to get the data, and then now I have to log into something else to go and use that, and I have to remember what it was, and it's another step which is going to make that decision much lower impactful. So I think it's very important to have that the business process and the data in the same system.
I agree 100%. And like you commented earlier, I think unfortunately companies are starting to think about getting these independent, unique applications, I think that's going to be a significant downfall and a waste of time and money, because as we mentioned, I don't want to beat the idea, but all these systems work on a different set of criteria, different dimensions, different units of measure, different time frames. So you try to sync up something that's given daily data with another system that's giving you weekly data, and their unit of measure, a lot of times you don't even question until something pops up. I mean, I've been involved with a company who we couldn't understand why we're having all these great discrepancies in the data. Well, one of the divisions, one of the locations around the world who was making this product reported it in single units. So a single unit of that product, that's how they measured it. The other one was measuring containers, and the container held 12 individual units. And so, until you really start digging down in this stuff, you don't understand even that the units of measurement of the data are different and need to be interpreted. So there's a lot of challenges to this whole data question.
Yeah. Well, Joe, one of the things we talked about a little bit earlier that I want to make sure we come back and talk about sort of taking action and making focused change is around this idea of investing and becoming a customer of choice. So when you think about the ways that our data quality allows us to run a better process for our suppliers, or our data quality allows us to better actually manage our suppliers when it comes to active engagement, where do you see some overlaps between understanding the importance of data quality and truly wanting to act on this idea of being better partners to our suppliers?
I'll give you a real example. I was consulting here to an extremely large wine producer here in the United States. And they buy a piece of equipment that it's $500,000, the basic piece of equipment, and you can never buy it for $500,000 because you go out to all these additional add-ons, and so it's $1 million a copy. And the lead time was 18 months. And so what we said is, where are we breaking down? Do we have data that could be helpful to you, and you have data that could be helpful to us? So we had this kind of, which Vishal just mentioned earlier, about this breakdown, an increased level of openness and communications around what we need as trading partners on data. And so what we agreed to, we found out that this company, the reason why it was an 18-month lead time is because of one component that they need to buy from their supplier, who needs to go into the end unit, right? And so we said, okay, and it's a very expensive component. And they said, well, we can't commit because we don't know what our customer base is. And this company in the United States is a very large customer of theirs. So what we did is very simple, not anything, whiz bang, real creative. We said, what if we give you a non-committal forecast for 24 months and 36 months? These people never negotiated their price. Their product was the Rolls Royce, and you never got a price. We were able to negotiate, not a lot, 5% on $1 million piece of equipment, but it was the idea that we now reach a new level of partnership because we understood their problem and we had data that could help them solve their problem, and we had an understanding now of how the data would be used. So that's a real life situation where we use data to benefit both parties, and we both came out with a lower cost product, less lead time, and they could plan their resources better. Similar, and just give you another wine example, only because there's so many examples out there. But
there's the same. Joe, keep talking.
Yeah. Well, just another example is wine barrels. Wineries throughout the world need to buy barrels for their wine for their crop each year, right? Mm-hmm. But when you think about it, the other half of the year, those cooperages is the name of what they call the industry of making barrels. They're idle half the time, because they only get the orders, So what we did is we coordinated global coordination of planning and forecasting, where we kept the cooperage at 80-90% capacity throughout the whole year. That allowed them to get operational efficiency and pass those savings on to their customers. So this exchange of data is very important to not only strengthen the relationship, but to gain operational efficiencies on both sides.
Yeah, and it's great to have those real world examples, right? Because that really sort of brings to life working on data quality can seem abstract, as important as we all acknowledge it is. As we have a few more minutes, Phil, I want to come back to you, whether it's a question, whether it's comments from the chat. Anything that you wanted to bring into the conversation with Joe and Vishal while we still have them?
So there was a question actually from Ben, and Joe kind of started to answer that actually just in the last comments. But Ben was asking, are the trends in industries that utilize supply chain data better than others? Like, what can we learn from those industries that do a much better job of leveraging, of cleaning their data, of having higher trust with the quality of their data? And I know that we've probably only got a couple of minutes to answer that question, so it's putting you on the spot a little bit, Joe. But anything that immediately comes to mind to Ben's question of like, what can we learn from others that are doing this really well, or industries that are doing this really well?
Yeah, I don't know if I could answer it on an industry level, just because I don't have that visibility to say, okay, what industry is doing better than the other. I just don't have that. I think it goes back to, though, the simple issues that Vishal mentioned earlier. That I don't want to miss that opportunity to amplify his comments. It's this idea of sharing data. We all have challenges with supply chain, whether we're providing a service and we don't have enough people to do it, we don't have enough call centers, they don't have the right data, or we're manufacturing a product. I think one of the challenges we're having now is not only to operate at that level, because then we always assume that our logistic infrastructure was sufficient, and now we're finding out that our logistics infrastructure, if it's a physical item, is not sufficient. So I think the idea is, for the best place to start is to sit down with your key suppliers, but you got to be careful because, as we're saying, there's some second and third suppliers that could bring you to your knees if you're not on top of it. But at least start with your key suppliers and say, what data do you need, and in what format, and in what frequency, to help you streamline your operation? And here's what I need from you as a supplier so I can run my organization better. We spent decades refining lean, just-in-time manufacturing. And now we found out that, of course, you always knew this, but it never really hit you until now, is, yeah, that all works if everything is in sync perfectly. And one hiccup can bring your whole operation to its knees. I mean, I'm struggling right now, not that I have a need for this, because I have older daughters, but this whole thing on baby formula. Yeah. I mean, how could we run out of baby formula? I mean, what's the issue, right? So my suggestion to the person who raised that question is, don't be shy. Go ask a lot of questions. There's no dumb question. Ask your suppliers, how do we operate better, efficient? How can we save you time, labor, money, and help you plan your supply chain better? And I'll guarantee you there will be some major insights that'll come about. Some may not be, some will be very intuitive, but you just get to reinforce and you open that dialogue and exchange. You have to start somewhere. That's my point. And I don't think anybody's doing a good job on this overall, because you look at the automotive industry has problems, the semiconductor industry has problems, food supply has problems, healthcare supplies. It's across the board. Everybody's struggling with supply chain related issues. So don't be cautious. I'd ask you to be bold. Don't worry about failure, because there's no way you're going to fail. You're only going to succeed, and you're only going to improve the business process.
Well, I think that's an excellent place to finish, Joe. And I think maybe if we have a big takeaway, it's that, yes, there are problems, but we're in very good company because we all share these problems, right? So thank you, Joe Yacura. Thank you, Vishal Patel. I appreciate you guys spending this hour with us today. Thank you to everybody in the audience who joined, and thank you, Phil, for spending that time with them. And thank you to everybody who's going to be listening to this later on demand. There are lots of resources, the 5th annual data quality study. We've got an audit checklist that we're going to be making available. So as Joe said, just get started. You can't fail. It can only get better. Thank you so much for joining us for this event today. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.